We're at the halfway point in the Women's World Championship match. Wenjun, the title holder, is leading by 2 points. She's simply playing more evenly than the challenger Tan Zhongyi. Yeah, Tan Zhongyi really struggling to find her form. But the match has shifted location from Shanghai, which is Zhu's hometown, to Chongqing, which is Tan's hometown. So maybe that will give Tan a bit of a boost. Let's see. This was game 7. So Zhu playing white, and she sees no reason to change from the way she's been opening in previous games. But Tan changes opening. Instead of playing e6 as we saw in previous games, she's gone for knight c6. And Zhu plays bishop b5, the reliable Rossolimo variation. Now, in my anti-Sicilian book and my courses, I recommend knight f6 in this position. But Tan goes for another of the main lines, e6, which has a pretty good reputation. Zhu plays castles kingside and knight e7. So this is the idea. The knight comes out. It's not going to be hassled by the pawn. And black wants to recapture with the knight. Now white can play this in various ways. Rook e1 is quite reliable. c3 as well. But Zhu goes for d4 straight away. So this takes the game back into an open Sicilian of sorts, with the bishop slightly oddly placed on b5. But this is reasonable. It's been played by, for example, Pomnishi, Vacher-Legrave. So if they're playing it, we know it can't be a bad way for white to play. Queen b6 looks very reasonable, puts pressure on the knight. So, white will either have to exchange here or exchange here. Well, Zhu takes on c6. I mean, this has been seen before. And if queen takes b5, then knight comes back to d4, and white will have quite a lead in development here. After the queen moves, the knight comes out, and so on. So after knight takes, Tan goes for b takes c6. And actually, we have this familiar pawn structure. For example, black could play d5 here. And we saw that in game 1, for example. But Tan plays differently. She plays knight g6. I mean, you can argue that this exchange has benefited black because it brings a pawn closer to the centre and it's possible to operate on the semi-open b file. But of course, this is fine for white. And white, having castled first, has just a slight lead in development, and that's pleasant. Bishop e7 looks reasonable, knight c3. And here black has a choice. Well, Tan just castles. You could set up a different kind of pawn structure with d6 and then c5. I mean, positionally, it's quite nice to sort of try to claim this square. You never know, later on this bishop might be able to come in here. But, of course, white is fine in these kind of positions. So I think white is very comfortable. But Tan goes for castles kingside. And that allows Zhu to just clamp a little bit in the middle and on the queen side. She plays knight a4, attacking the queen, which goes back, and now c5. So I think this is very much in Zhu's style. She plays quite positionally. So it means that really black should be breaking with d6 or d5. Otherwise, this pawn looks very odd. The bishop looks odd. But after this, and white exchanges en passant, then you can see that this c-pawn is isolated, and there's perhaps potential to occupy either c5 or c4. This could give white a positional advantage. You can see that white's structure is simply better. There are two split pawns that black has on the queen side. But it's not so simple, because this exchange has also given black's pieces some freedom. There's a threat to take on h2, and it should be possible to bring this bishop out, perhaps via a6, perhaps on b7, depends how white sets up, maybe even e5 as well. But first things first, white has to deal with the threat here. Now g3, to my eyes, looks like the most natural move here, because it blunts the bishop, it takes away this square. But I suspect that Zhu thought, after c5 and bishop b7, there are potentially problems on the long diagonal. And she had a 9-minute think and played instead queen h5. But I think, these kind of decisions, you have to feel your way through. That wasn't based on calculation. Rook b8. Okay, rook on the semi-open file, and so that's closed down with b3. I mean, it's not absolutely necessary to play like this. But Tan has a little idea in mind. Rook d8. Now that looks very sensible, because they're clearly, the bishop is unprotected and there are weak squares on the d file. Rook d1. Rook b4. So this is quite aggressive from Tan. Perhaps she wants to play bishop e5 and then rook d4, doubling on the d file. Yeah, I mean, this starts to get quite tactical now. Of course, black doesn't have to play like this. It's possible to throw this in here and claim one of those bishops. Although, I mean, I would say this is about equal, even though black has the two bishops, because this one on c8 isn't really great. Anyway, rook b4. So this starts to complicate the position. And Zhu plays in a very interesting way. She could just play, for example, bishop e3, and then I don't think black has much better than to exchange like this, to throw the knight in. And it looks about equal. Again, very similar to the other position. I think that's a safe way for white to play. But instead, Zhu plays bishop b2. Now, the bishop's great on the long diagonal, looking at g7, and covers those dart squares. But it allows knight f4. And actually, you can see that hits these two. And this involves a pawn sacrifice. After this, you can see that black can take here. Now, Tan throws in bishop a6 first, knocking back the rook, and then she takes on h2. This is very enterprising from Zhu. She's basically relying on the fact that these pieces are better than black's minor pieces, but also the fact that these rooks are split as well. Let's see how that plays out. So the bishop comes back, and queen c3 threatens g7, so queen g7 mate threatened. And if, let's say, e5, I mean, actually that's the move I'd quite like to play to block out the bishop, then actually this is uncomfortable for black. So you can see the rooks are split. This bishop on a6 is very poor. There's definite pressure there. So bishop f8 played instead by Tan. Good move. And knight c5 played. Now, that's probably inaccurate. It's tough to see why. There are some incredible tactics here. It's probably the computer thinks that this is the best way for white to play. But yeah, tricky position actually. With black's pieces, been a little bit offside, but black is a pawn up. But it should be okay for white. It feels like white should be okay here. But tricky. In any case, knight c5 played. Okay, here is where I'd like you to have a think. I will have a drink. Cheers. Black to play. What would you do next? The knight has just come into c5. Cheers. Black to play. Well, you can see that the knight threatens the bishop. The queen threatens the rook. It's not possible to play bishop takes knight because of queen g7 mate. So Tan, in, well, 8 seconds, played rook b6. She obviously thought it's a forced move. The rook moves back and protects the bishop on a6. But there's an extraordinary move here. And now I'm going to go into a little bit of detail because the tactics are beautiful. So watch this. First of all, bishop e2. Okay, so it's a Zwischenzug. So, of course, this could be captured, but then the rook hangs as well. Okay, so what about rook takes rook? Well, look what happens. Queen takes. So the queen is activated. And if queen takes rook, queen h4 check. And incredibly, although black is a whole rook down, it's white's move, but there is no good defense here for white. And that, notice the bishop covers the b8 square, so nothing doing there. Yeah, mate threatened. And if e5, then queen takes queen. That's a very neat point. And if g3, then bishop takes g3 and black checkmates. So tactically very interesting. And watch this, another incredible tactic. What about rook e1? Does that keep things together? Well, here black has another amazing move. Rook d5. Wow! So threatening rook h5 check and then queen h2 mate. So let's just see that. Takes, check. Oops, sorry. If takes here, then check and mate. And yes, if pawn takes, then the other rook swings over, rook h4, and that's checkmate. I mean, after rook d5, I mean, that's actually a knockout blow. There is no good defense. It's incredible. Look at all these pieces. They're all hanging. Yes, if rook takes bishop, then check, and it's still checkmate. Wow. It reminds me of something that Tal said, that you know, there was a position where all his pieces were hanging, and he said, well, my opponent can only take one piece at a time. Brilliant. So I'm sure that, you know, Tan simply thought that rook b6 was forced, and she probably didn't even consider bishop e2. Anyway, she played rook b6. And that means that Zhu has kind of settled here. The knight is on c5, pretty well established. The queen comes into the middle, closing off that diagonal. In the endgame, then, well, this gives white a clear advantage. Like this, for example. I mean, black might hold this, but okay. Well, we know rook and bishops of opposite colour. We know how dangerous they can be. Anyway, Tan plays okay. She plays queen e7. Rook c1 played to support the knight. And Tan goes for rook b5. And she had a very interesting opportunity here. She could have taken and then played rook b5. So obviously there's a pin here, and bishop d4 supports the knight. And then a mass exchange. Now, two bishops against a rook could potentially be very good for the bishops, but then how do you assess this endgame? maybe Tan just got here and thought, this looks too risky, with the king miles away, the active rook, and potentially this pawn just marching down the board. In fact, black is able to stop those the queenside pawns with the bishops, and I mean it's a very unclear position. There's going to be a race, possible to take this pawn as well, but it does look as though black has some chances there. I mean, I played it out against the computer actually, and yeah, mad complications. And in the game that I played against the computer, actually it ended in a draw. But certainly that would be an interesting way for black to play. It would put some pressure on white. But instead, rook b5. And that allows Zhu to consolidate the positional advantage with queen d4. So you can see everything is protected here. And yeah, we know that these kind of bishops of opposite color endgames, they are very tricky. This bishop is terrible, and there is potential. Well, I mean, if this is captured, then white is obviously better, and if this comes back, then you can see once the rook comes in, this is very tricky. That bishop is dreadful. So black has to be careful here. Now the game went check. And the bishop dropped back to c8. I mean, what a terrible piece. e5. So that cements the pawn on e6. Which means that bishop is really bad. And Tan exchanged. Now, Tan is a pawn up. But Zhu holds this tremendous positional advantage. And that bishop on c8 is simply dreadful. But all we can say at the moment is that white has compensation. It's certainly not better for white. So let's see how things develop. Now that's a good move. This pawn, given a chance, would like to advance to a4. In fact, there's a critical moment coming up in a second. But, I mean, black should be okay here. Even though the bishop on c8 is terrible, well, as Eddie Gufeld used to say, even the worst bishop in the world is better than the best knight. Well, he was prone to exaggeration, but I get what he means. So, for example, here, now Tan goes for g5, trying to open up the position. I think that's very reasonable when you've got the bishops. You want to do that. She could have taken and played like this, because that bishop can come out. And here, if that rook can swing round to d7, that bishop can enter the game on this diagonal. Or like this, f6. There's a little bit of pressure, and that king can come into the game as well, perhaps here. So black can hold this. g5, still, I think this is fine for black. But that knight is pretty good. Nevertheless, black should be fine here. Now here, Tan plays bishop b7. That's too passive. To my eyes, a really natural move is a4. So you get rid of that potential weakness on a5. You create a weakness on b3. And the rook now activates. The rook is doing something. It's pressing on this pawn. So if pawn takes, then rook b4. Well, that's unpleasant for white. The rook looks really good there. And if bishop c5, yes, positionally desirable exchange for white. But having exchanged here, well, how is white going to make progress? The knight won't be able to move because this is on. The rook can't move away from protecting the knight. So even though this bishop is absolutely rotten, it feels like black should be all right in that position. But instead, bishop b7 was played. And this is just way too passive. Now, bishop c5, that's a killer. Look, compare this position with the last. that pawn is potential weakness. It can't advance to a4 now because the knight covers. And that bishop is dreadful. And the king comes in to g5. So, you know, that pawn is going to be taken. Not a nice position for black. If a4, yes, that could be played because knight takes, allows rook takes pawn. But here, this is pretty rotten. And b4. And there's potential for that rook to come into d8 to hit the bishop. Should be winning for white. It's tricky, but should be winning. But after bishop a8, well, that's just game over. Let's see what happened. Rook c4, the rook swings up, and this has potential, well, to attack on the king side and a swing here as well. Game finished like this. I mean, this activity with the rook was all in vain. Rook g4 check is a nice move because that just pushes the king to a worse square. It means that when this rook switches over and hits the bishop, then it'll go with check, basically, which just makes matters worse. Rook takes, a check. And b4 protects that beautiful blockading knight on c5. And here, well, I mean, white is obviously winning because that bishop is drops on a8. I think that was the final move. On ChessBase, it gives king d5. I suspect that that's because the kings were positioned on e4 and d5 for the end of the game. So I think that's the final position. And this is a fitting final position. The knight is just rock solid on c5. That bishop really is absolutely terrible. I'm afraid Gufeld was wrong. That knight is wonderful. That bishop is terrible. I think in this game, Tan really showed the deficiencies in her positional play. She almost kind of accepted a poor position. She never managed to shake her way out of it using tactical possibilities. So, you know, coming back to this position, this is where you have to realize, okay, this might get tricky. And that's when you start looking for these unusual moves. Bishop e2. I mean, that is an incredible move. And yeah, this one, rook d5. Wow. Amazing stuff. But because you feel the danger, that should prompt you for looking for this kind of thing. And then later on, I think this move should still be okay for black. And for me, that feels like a very natural move to get rid of that a-pawn. Zhu in this match, and I think in this game, is playing just more evenly than Tan. And, you know, she fully deserves her lead in this match. So it's now 3 points, a 3-point lead, 7-4, with just 5 games remaining. Well, it might not be 5 games because Tan needs to hit back quickly, or the match could be over before the stipulated 12 games. Anyway, I'll keep you up to date. Hope you're enjoying this Women's World Championship.